Alright, time for another draft physics video presentation. Alright, probably just two slit stuff, but we'll see where it goes. So there's this double slit experiment. Professor Dave explains. This whole idea of professors not having any real integrity. I mean, they're teachers, and they're teaching just nonsense, and there's huge flaws in what they say and how they describe the actual experiments, the actual people labeled with those experiments and the whole thing. So it's worth going through another pile of this junk, and it's junk. Not teaching anything from, like I said, a professor is supposed to be somebody who, he's at the point where he's not supposed to be just regurgitating nonsense. He's supposed to know it for good reason, and I don't think any of these people have done any reasoning to have good reason. But anyway,
in learning about the first few discoveries that led to the development of quantum mechanics, we discussed wave-particle duality. So we understand.
Yeah, so we understand. There's no way to understand it. It's just gibberish. Particles waving in some kind of medium that is completely undescribed. Just mush, absolute mush as a description of reality.
That both light and matter behave as both.
So again, just turning photons into electrons, and electrons into atoms, and atoms into compounds, and compounds into wildebeests. They all do the same thing. They're all the same thing. No, a wildebeest is not a photon. Photons are different than wildebeests. Shit.
Particles and waves. But we glossed over some of the technical details.
You glossed over everything. You always gloss over. You'll gloss over the evidence and the experiments, and you'll just recite a three-bear story. You won't go anywhere near the truth.
So let's zoom in for a moment.
Yeah, right. So here it is again, Thomas Young. Okay, an audiophile guy, a guy who mostly worked with sound. So as I pointed out, the double slit experiment, Young did it with a cardboard box, or a box, all right, with two pinholes in it. Okay, so it's just pinholes, round little holes. His image was in sunlight, so they were a bunch of overlapping colored circles. Okay, obviously not sophisticated enough to glean out of the experiment the fact that there was two patterns, that the pattern broke and then the pattern continued. Okay, so none of this was part of Young's analysis. Just this crude, cruddy, sloppy, messy, whatever you want to say, image of diffraction. Let's understand Newton, 100 years earlier, had already done the single impediment experiment. Okay, light diffracts, it creates a pattern, okay, with a single impediment, or the single slit. So he had done the inside surface experiment, right? This would be the inside, and this would be the outside. Right, so outside surfaces and inside surfaces. And guess what? They are different, and one could pose that they're different for a reason, but the idea is that this distance was key. How far apart the surfaces are decided, okay, what your pattern would look like. And that's the common feature between those two experiments. But obviously, the inside slit and the outside slit is essentially the double slit. So the double slit has the two interior slits and has the two exterior surfaces. So nothing remarkable about Young's experiment at all. Newton had well described this effect. He had no clue how it happened. I mean, he didn't pose a theory, but it's famous, Newton's rings. And all you're doing when you're making slits is you're saying, let's not look at this part, okay, and this part. Let's only look at this right here. That's all the double slit does, is try to turn the pattern, instead of a circle, into a bunch of lines. Same exact phenomenon. Okay, so nothing at all remarkable about Young's experiment at all to somebody who had any knowledge of what the physics had already established. Somebody who knew what Newton had done wouldn't have said, hey, Young's experiment is remarkable. We've never seen anything like it. Blah, 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 blah. No, wrong. Factually incorrect.
In 1801, Thomas Young performed experiments where light was passed through a plane with two slits in it, striking a...
All right, so that didn't happen. Let's just understand. He didn't do slit experiment. He didn't pass light through a plane. He first passed it through a single slit, right? So we already know that diffracts light. But anyway, he passed it through a single slit to spread it. All right, and then put it through the two slits. So first he had to make a beam of light by putting a single aperture in the way. And then he had to spread the beam to get it over the two slits. So that's the... so they always portray it as this complex. And now look at the pattern he's showing. This is not what Young saw. All right, Young, as I just pointed out, he saw the circle, okay, the round circle of the slits. Okay, instead of a bar pattern, because they weren't rectangular slits, he saw circles of light. Circles of light, circles of light. He didn't use monochromatic light, so he didn't get that pattern. So you can't see how, I mean, you people can't have a little bit of integrity and say that they're so loose with the facts, they're so loose with the truth, and this is their evidence. They're telling us this is the reason why you should believe, because that's what Young saw. That's not what he saw. That's an electron pattern. Photons don't do that pattern. So you can't see the fraud in this. This guy shows you this. He says, calls it light. He's got a red arrow. Light creates this pattern. It doesn't create that pattern. Now, the math says it should create that pattern, but technically it doesn't create that pattern. It creates bars of light. So it's a lie. I mean, it's a frickin' lie. I mean, he's a professor, right? You don't think a professor should be able to do what I just said? Well, I shouldn't say that's the Young experiment, because it's not. And I shouldn't imply that's a photon pattern when it's not a photon pattern. Photons won't do that.
Screen beyond. The diffraction and interference patterns that resulted...
Let's understand, the diffraction doesn't really have a pattern. The diffraction is just saying it's spreading. There's no pattern in diffraction by itself, beyond the pattern of doming the light. That is, there's always going to be more light in the center than there is on the periphery. Okay, but that's it. There's no pattern to diffraction.
Clearly supported the wave model of light.
Right. So again, this is why we believe. We took fake evidence. We turned Young's experiment into something it wasn't. We forgot about what Newton did. We ignore the fact that this is really about surfaces, that the two different surfaces are what create different patterns. The surfaces facing each other are different than the surfaces facing an open universe. That's the theory, right? Two surfaces facing each other means the electrons on both of these surfaces are panicking. They're not liking it. Right? Where a surface like this, the electrons here are saying, hey, I got all kinds of free space. I got all kinds of places to go if I want to go somewhere. I don't have to go, if the pressure, with slits, you're saying to the electrons, move this way and move this way. Get around the slit. They're not saying, oh, I'll just fly out here into space, because the electrons say, no, there's other electrons over there. You can't understand that that's what the key difference between this is and this is.
With the brighter bands representing constructive interference.
Representing, yes. You guessed, and you guessed badly. Like many physicists before you guess at something, you establish it as a fact. Again, Benjamin Franklin made sort of an honest mistake, mislabeled plus and minus, and to this day, they just keep the fraud alive. They just keep saying, we're not going to fix it. Let's just keep it wrong. And now, for their math to work, they have to have the current move in an opposite direction to the voltage in a wire, which makes zero sense.
And the darker bands representing destructive interference. with the width of the bands being a function of the frequency of the light.
Right. Well, what was shown in the Young experiment even is what was deciding the frequency of the light is where you're remaking a photon, and you can make a blue one first, and then the red ones have a wider wavelength, so one full wavelength will be a longer distance. So you have to have a longer distance of combination to create a red one. So you can't get a red one here. You can only get a red one further over. And so it has nothing to do with where the photons actually went, the pieces. Just has to do with where you can reconstruct one of that color.
Later in the century, Maxwell showed that light is a wave of...
No, he didn't show any such thing. He just took a bunch of other people's equations and consolidated them. And again, right, I can't do it all for you people. So yes, I can't rewrite Maxwell's equations, recognizing that the only difference, there's no electric field, magnetic field. There's either a dipole field or a monopole field. So, you know, this is such a simple distinction. So somebody who's a little clever in math could probably redo Maxwell's equations and just recognize that what you're really doing, you know, is that you have this structure where you have a charge here and a charge here, and that's a magnet essentially. A plus and a minus right next to each other is a dipole field. That is, it's doing two different things to something that's around it, right? It's saying to an electron, yes, you know, shoot over here, and then it's saying no, shoot away from here. So it's two opposite impulses. And then the other field obviously would be just the plus field or the minus field. And so all Maxwell's equation is doing this bisection, and instead of doing it the rational way, by just recognizing it's about dipoles versus monopoles, that's the distinction. Instead, he called it magnetism and electricity. When no, it's dipoles and charge. Charge, monopole charges and dipole charges. And those are the distinctions. Dipoles make purple. Monopoles make blue and red. Another way to think about it. So Maxwell's equations are just accounting for the fact that the fields between those two things will be very different. A positive charge will have a red field, a negative charge has a blue field, and a magnet has a lot of purple field.
Of oscillating electric and magnetic fields.
No such thing. There's no wave of light. The light is a bunch of discrete bits, quanta, moving at the speed of light, okay, and having a distance between them. That's it. Bullets fired at a rate.
So it seemed as though the case was closed.
Yeah, so they closed the case based on a perversion of reality. A nonsense where we don't know what a magnetic monopole is. There's no such thing. When clearly every atom that they know becomes magnetic is clearly a dipole, and the dipole is made out of protons and electrons. You can't make a magnet without polarizing an atom. They know that, so why are they pretending we can't find the magnetic monopole? Duh.
On the declaration of light as waves. But as we said, in 1905, Einstein solved the problem of the photoelectric effect by...
So again, we solved it, we finished it, we completed it, we understand it now. Let's understand, 2 years before Einstein died, he said, I've been studying photons for 50 years and I haven't improved my understanding one iota. So Einstein conceded he doesn't know what the fuck is going on.
By assigning particle nature to light. Thus, wave-particle duality was born.
Right, a stupid, idiotic nonsense that every reasonable person should have said not a good enough answer. Way short of good enough. It's on and off. It's up and down. It's, you know, light and dark. I mean, it's just silly.
Later, de Broglie proposed that particles...
Right, and then the biggest stupid idiotic move in the history of mankind was, let's say everything is everything. Everything is the same thing. So photons are flying ducks. And, I mean, it's just stupid. So de Broglie took something we know is a discrete bit, a thing, an object. And because photons have a frequency, he just said, well, look, let's make electrons the same thing. And so we'll just say how fast it's going is its frequency. Yeah, that's the entire theory. That because something has speed, now all of a sudden has a period. Why would somebody think so? Why would anybody do that? Well, it's only because, it works mathematically to some extent, because they know the frequency makes a photon more capable of affecting an electron. And that's all it really comes down to, is frequency has an effect on tipping electrons out of their condition. So when an electron is attached to a proton, for example, there's a binding energy, and you need to hit it, okay, to knock it out of that binding energy. And if you hit it slowly and you let the electron swing this way and then swing back, the electron's not leaving. But if you can hit it fast enough, that is, the electron swings to over here, and then you hit it again, then you can free that electron. And the principle's that simple, that rational, and yet they call it a frequency. It's not a frequency. Photons have a frequency. Electrons do not, unless you pulse them on purpose. If you give them a frequency, they can have one, but they have none innately.
Must therefore also display wave-like behavior. And this was shown to be true in an experiment.
So again, it wasn't shown to be true, so this is another one of the big frauds. So here now they're talking about what electrons do when they go through the slit. Now, I should have thought of this years ago, in terms of just how flawed the whole argument is, because photons, I guess I couldn't have thought of it a few years ago because I didn't realize that photons weren't really interfering. They were just being reconstructed. They're being broken by impediments, obstacles, things that change their phase. A polarizing film changes the phase. Okay, so I've already sort of been over this, but the polarizing for light film relies on, what they've really done is just made a film where there's 2x polarization here and only 1x here. So there's only a 2x, 1x. So it's just a surface that has got a second layer. All right, one's this layer, and then there's 2 layers, and then there's 1 layer, and then there's 2 layers. So all you're really talking about is when you double the layer, you double the amount of, when you put a second film on there, you create a phase shift. You slow it down a little bit because it has to go through the medium. And by slowing it down, you change the phase of the bits, and so now your light is broken. You can't see it because you've rearranged the frequency. And then but you can take 2 beams from 2 different locations that are now have rearranged a frequency. Okay, the frequency's been changed on these 2 beams, but when you put them together, they match again because one of them's been, it fills in the gaps the other one's missing, and then you have a photon again. So you can reconstruct a photon. So anyway, that's something I hadn't occurred to me a few years ago. But anyway, this electron thing, electrons are completely different, right? They're not coming at a frequency. So you can't be reconstructing something. There's no need to have 2 electrons for you to make an electron. You don't need a ray of electron. You don't need a bunch of quanta. There's none of those restrictions. Right? I mean, a single electron can go somewhere and make a single electron hits. I mean, there's no need to break them in pieces. So anyway, the key to the electrons are, I guess I should put this over here. So the key to electrons is when you think about what you're doing when you're shooting electrons, is you have a whole bunch of electrons, in let's say random positions. I should have randomized that one more. What are those electrons going to do in that beam? Well, obviously, I could argue, they're going to do kind of like what happens with the magnetic field lines. These electrons all hate each other, right? And so they're going to start moving away from each other. When they're really close, they're going to move away, and they're going to try to find a place that's neutral. Like this one can't really go this way, and it can't go this way, and it can't go this way because, there's something, and the only way it can go is here, so it ends up going here. So in this one, some other one will be over here, and it'll just move into this position. So what you're going to end up doing, the electrons will, by nature, line up with each other. They'll create bands of distance that's equal, right? Equidistant, to try to balance their pressure. So electrons, by their very nature, want to create a bar pattern. They want to do it. Okay, so when you put them through the slits, it's the same argument's going to take place. Is they're going to come out of those slits, and they're still going to have that pressure. And now you've just made them fewer. You've taken away some of these, and you've taken away some of these. And so now these can spread out, and they're still going to spread out in the same bar-like way. Because electrons they do this thing, right? Electrons like to be, this increases their distance from each other. If they stack up like this, well, then they're closer to each other. But they can make themselves further away from each other by stacking up with this kind of geometry. They can make the diagonal lines, which are longer distances, and so they can be further from each other. And they're going to just do that. They're going to tend to want to line up in a geometry. They're going to have a preferential geometry. And that's why they create a pattern. It's just so it doesn't have anything to do with the slits. The slits is just bullshit. So again, and they never do the electron slit experiment in any kind of rational way, right? They do it very much smaller because the electrons are moving very fast. They can't shoot electrons really slow. See, if they shot the electron really slow, then they could have really big slits, right? And they could show you the experiment. But the fact is they can't shoot an electron really slow, like a 20-mile-an-hour, electron. Well, then they could make a really big slit and show you the pattern. It'd be nice and easy. They could do the experiment right here and show you. But no, see, they can only get the electron going really fast, like 3/4 the speed of light or some kind of preposterous thing. So it ends up being this little tiny, tiny, tiny slit, So anyway, so the whole thing is just so bogus. Electrons are fundamentally different than protons, and they're making an on-off pattern. Again, I've said it's the simplest pattern you can create in the universe, and these professors think every time they see it, it must be wave interference, it must be the simplest pattern you can create. And so I've just given you an example of some reason why electrons would create the same pattern, and it has absolutely nothing to do with any kind of interference or any of that. It just has to do with the fact that electrons hate each other. And what are they going to do about that hate? Well, they're all going to build their houses equal distant from each other. Jesus.
Just like Young's more than 100 years prior.
So it wasn't just like in any way. It's, it's a different pattern in two slits. It's not creating the double pattern. So again, it's missing one of the fundamental elements, right? The two-slit pattern in light does not create that pattern. Okay, it creates bar, I'll go with longer bars for intensity. Bar, and then there's a gap, and then there's bar, and then it gets brighter, and then it goes down again, and then it goes bar, and then it goes bigger and brighter. So it's not the same pattern as that pattern.
This modern version is what we are typically referring to when we talk about the double-slit experiment.
Right. They do it however they want, right? Whatever they're trying to demonstrate, they'll use photons or they'll switch to electrons. And the assumption is we're supposed to believe it's the same mechanism. So they speculate that photons go through both slits. Well, you might be able to get away with that because photons have huge polarization, all kinds of reasons why you might be able to get away with some of that crap. But clearly electrons, the idea that the electron goes through both slits, again, is just as a starting position, is an extraordinary theory. I mean, it's a bizarre claim, and you really should have hard evidence to be able to assert that, and they don't need any evidence. They just say, we all fell for it, so you should too.
From this, it was shown that a beam of electrons exhibits diffraction and interference.
Right. So again, they call it interference when, again, as I just pointed out, that's exactly logically what electrons are going to want to do, is to create that pattern. If I had a pile of electrons just sitting in a box, that's what they're going to want to do. They're going to want to distribute themselves so they can avoid each other, and the consequence of that is they're going to create bars.
Patterns, just like light does. This demonstrates the wave-like properties of electrons, and by extension, matter in general. Later,
so he just said this is a matter phenomenon. So, and they have no evidence of it. What is it a phenomenon of, as I've stated, is you can understand that no surface is a hard surface. They're all made out of atom surfaces. And they know that surface is very active, that molecules are popping off the surface all the time and then resticking. It's a complex place. It's not a simple place. There's no piece of steel with some sort of just steel wall. No, it's covered with atomic particles that border between the two mediums. Okay, the electrons are on the surface. They're on the outside of the atom, and that's what's facing the world is electrons. And they're just pretending they don't know that physics.
Intensity experiments showed that even an individual electron, when passing through biprisms or slits, will interfere with itself.
All right, biprisms. So now they do some experiment where they say it's the same thing when it's clearly not the same thing. Just like when they say they have a beam splitter and it creates two equal beams. Well, you can show that it's impossible by their own accepted theory that it creates two equal beams.
Making the wave-like nature of the electron undeniable.
Oh, see? So that's how far they go. They go so far as to say we've proven beyond reasonable doubt that we have this evidence that our silly theory, and look at what he did to the history, and look what he did to the experiment. Does he show us actual experiments? No, he shows us simulations. So let's see the single slit electron experiment. So does anybody know of any location I can go to where somebody actually performs the single slit electron experiment? And what's the slowest moving electron they perform this experiment on? Why can't they create an electron that moves really slow? What's the limitation? Why aren't they able to do it? So then they can make a really enormous slit. But anyway, so yeah, there's no evidence that in the electrons, okay, if I have a slit of a certain size and I use the same size as I would have used in the double slit, so I keep the slit exactly the same size as what it would have been in the double slit, there's no evidence that these patterns are incompatible, that the single slit and electrons will also create the pattern, and that if I just put another slit right in here, I will in fact just create the same pattern over again, because the two are so close to each other, the two slits, that they'll just produce the same pattern right on top of each other. So where's the evidence of them doing that experiment? Where's the evidence of the single slit electron experiment demonstrating anything fundamentally different than the two slit? Can't find it. I can't find it.
So it was shown that electrons act as both particles and waves.
No, it wasn't, and you're silly.
But not just electrons. Neutrons were also shown to exhibit diffraction patterns.
Okay, so again, he won't show us that experiment either. So this is when they bring up buckyballs or something. So buckyballs do the same thing, right? It's like, Veritasium tried to do the single photon experiment, sending single photons, and the pattern he got was 50% noise. Okay, so it was so bad. It was just crappy results, really. Yes, there was a pattern, but barely visible. So when they use these buckyballs, right, so each pattern gets more and more fuzzy. So when you're using photons, you get nice bars. When you use electrons, you're getting some fuzz. And when you use buckyballs, you're getting a ton of fuzz. The pattern's barely there. It's this line. It's a horrible pattern. Not even close to clear, decisive, what you would expect Okay, it's barely a pattern. And it makes sense, right? If all of these things are just interacting with electrons, if all of this is just the fact that there's electrons in the surface of substances, the photon has to interact with the electrons on the surface. Therefore, the photon is going to be deflected based on hitting electrons. Then you understand it as electrons hitting, okay? Electrons, well, you know, electrons hit electrons, they're going to bounce off each other's force, so this electron can go that way and this one could go that way. You know, that's could happen. They're going to exchange the momentum and change directions. And then clearly a buckyball, 50 atoms, hits an electron. It's still hitting something, okay? It's not as big a thing, but it's still hitting a charge, and so it's going to be deflected because it's hitting a charge.
It must be understood that since all particles are also waves, literally any object could hypothetically exhibit a diffraction pattern.
Hypothetically, if anything you were saying were true, then yes, the pigs could fly if we glue wings on them.
So long as the object passes through an aperture roughly the size of the object's wavelength. But
so, you know, my wavelength is supposed to be preposterously high, I guess, somehow, even though I don't seem to be moving very much.
remember that massive objects have incredibly tiny wavelengths.
See, so they've established that your mass is deciding your wavelength, right? So I'm supposed to pass through a slit that's, you know, a billion zillion micro nanometers or whatever, you know, a billionth of a nanometer. Oh, yeah, I guess that won't work.
So for something like a human being to diffract, they would have to pass through an aperture.
Oh, look at that. Look at the silliness of this, right? I mean, you know, we can all say, now, isn't that your physics is just silly? I mean, yes, clearly the big object can't get through something smaller than an atom. You know, a lot smaller than an atom. I mean, this is just so stupid.
Around 10 to the negative 36 meters wide, which is a trillionth of a trillionth of a trillionth of a meter.
Right. So why are we even discussing this nonsense? Because clearly it's just irrational mush. I mean, the idea that this distance matters, well, it matters only because the two surfaces have electrons on them, and you're going to have more electrons the further away they are. The closer they get, the more the electrons have to get the hell out of there. Just a fact. Because they hate each other. Let's pretend we don't know that. Yeah. So we can do this wacky nonsense.
So this will be pretty tough, no matter how much you diet. In this way, we begin to see...
In this way, we avoid having to do the experiment and prove our theory right. In this way, we create preposterous circumstances and just tell you, well, that's what would happen if I could shove a human being through a slit smaller than an electron. That's what would happen.
How Newtonian mechanics is not the fundamental descriptor.
Okay, so more nonsense. There's nothing wrong with Newtonian mechanics. You haven't proven any of those laws wrong. All you're saying was, I'll pretend Newton said things he didn't say, right? But that's about it, right? I mean, Newton didn't posit a theory, and they'll put theory in his mouth, though. Newton told you what will happen, and he was correct. And the tiny, tiny thing he didn't account for was things he couldn't see. You can only watch a planet move across the sky, right? And you say, there's a planet. It's there, right? That location, so many arc seconds. But what he can't see is the center of the planet's gravity. Can't see the stuff moving inside of it. So when Newton says the sun is in this position, he might not realize that, well, it's not really in that position because it has more mass on this side than it does this side because the inside of the sun is precessing. And all you need, that's how little Newton was off. And all you need to do is precess the mass of the sun, that is, change its position, its center of gravity in space. See, we can see the outside of objects. We can't see its center of gravity. And the only thing Newton's equations are missing is accounting for the center of gravity.
Of motion, but rather that it emerges from quantum mechanics.
So, more bullshit. What emerges from quantum mechanics is religion. You've just created a silly, stupid God theory. It's just more, we're just going backward in time. And yes, your God isn't coherent in terms of being anything intelligent or sensible, but it's just a bunch of magical properties. Magical properties. You just can't let go of magic.
As objects become large enough that their wavelengths are negligible. So don't worry, everything you learned in classical physics will still work just...
Oh, you just said it was old hat nonsense and bullshit. No, obviously it isn't.
fine for any object you can see with your eyes. But along with these waves of matter came the wave function. And
again, the wave function doesn't mean anything. It's just recognizing that we have limitations in our perception. So if I go to Las Vegas, I put a pair of dice in my hand and I throw them, I can't calculate all the variables that are going to decide how the dice flip. But what I can understand is there's only certain outcomes. There's only certain things in the dice. And that I can figure out that if I have enough randomizing variables, there'll be the same number of snake eyes as there are boxcars over time. That certain patterns of the dice will have an equal chance of arising. And I can understand those probabilities. But I can say that's exactly what's happening in the slit experiment. There's no surprise probability. What you're doing is saying, look, I've randomized the gun. The gun shoots a photon in random positions, right? So I've randomized the gun. It goes up and down, but it shoots at any time. So it could shoot here or it could shoot here, and it does so with the same probability. And so when the light gets to the slit, there's some beams of light that are going to go really close to the slit, and there's some beams of light that are going to go right through the middle. I know there's a higher probability of this than there is this, and I know there's a higher probability, and I can speculate that there's a higher probability that this one gets deflected more and this one gets deflected less. And that's the wave function. It's not doing anything more than just recognizing that there's a difference. I can create a wave function just as valid as their wave function out of just recognizing these probabilities. Okay, that you're going to have more deflection the closer you are to the surface, and that there's only so much in this surface. See, theirs creates this infinite pattern. There could be lines going straight this way, but they've never proven that. They've never done the experiment where they put photographic film here on the sides, okay, to show us the pattern going infinitely. Okay, never done that. But because I would argue that it can only diffract based on the number of electrons. The more electrons, the more possibility for diffraction. The lines are really a representation of how many, the bars are really telling you how many interactions are possible for something traveling through the obstacle course. What's the most things it can hit? And there's a limit to how many that's possible.
Quest to describe it mathematically. This would be impossible without the creation.
All right, so this is more nonsense. This would be impossible. I just showed you how it's very possible. I've explained to these people who believe this phenomenon's all over the place. The radar experiment, where they take two separate radar guns. There's no slit to screw the radar up. It's two guns shooting the same frequency. And that the logic can tell you that if I just turn those guns, instead of shooting them up, if I just turn them this way, I would know that just like a car traveling between New York and New Jersey, it could run into this problem where the signal from New York on the same station, the signal from New Jersey on the same station, or Pennsylvania, will end up being indecipherable. I won't be able to get the radio station. I won't be able to get one or the other. And so it's called jamming. You can jam signals by making them unresolvable by the instruments we use to resolve it. Okay, so this is another thing I thought of as a test. So this is another test. I have to just think about what... maybe somebody knows what the best way to detect temperature. What's the most sensitive temperature detecting device? Because I was thinking you could just use thermocouples. The idea you take two unlike metals and you stick them together, you fuse them, and you just run a wire off that, and it'll create a plus and minus voltage based on how hot it is. And so you can make those pretty small. So you just arrange a bunch of these thermocouples as your screen, where you're receiving the pattern. And the idea would be is you just measure how much heat. And so the heat would be a function of the radiation, right? I mean, all radiation, I think, creates heat. I don't think there's any... I think the demonstration of that is gravity. Gravity creates heat, okay, because gravity is causing motion. And any motion will be detectable as heat. So what's the smallest, most accurate way to detect temperature change? So the idea would be is that the pattern, okay, the bar pattern for photons, whatever, however you want to, so the on-off pattern, I would speculate that if you just line that up on and you have a heat register, so you're detecting little places and you're detecting the temperature at those positions, that the temperature here at the place where there's no photons is going to be exactly the same temperature as it is here where you see photons. So the energy is actually hitting that location. It's just not hitting it in a form that can be seen as a photon. The photons are broken, but they're still energy, and they're still hitting those dark places. They're just not going to produce a visible photon. So that's a way of testing this bullshit of destructive interference. Now, you could already speculate that this is the truth based on polarizing film for light, because it doesn't get hot. So this theory that the photons are destroyed or are absorbed doesn't make much sense, because if they're absorbed, why doesn't the film get hot?
Of quantum mechanics, which was achieved by a host of brilliant minds. But we will focus on two people.
See, more of this just horse shit, this idolization of... Yes, we'll focus on Schrodinger, who invented a mocking thought experiment to mock your quantum mechanics. It's just so ironic, right? They're using Schrodinger's wave equation. Schrodinger hated what you turned it into because it's a religion. And it's just ironic that he made fun of the very notions you're saying are taking place.
In particular, Erwin Schrödinger and Werner Heisenberg. Let's move forward.
Right, and Heisenberg's idiotic notion that because we can't see it, we can make up any story we want. So because the little things are so small, we can actually say they're three bears. And, they have a hat, and they smoke cigars, and they eat porridge, and they sleep in beds. And you can make up a whole silly fucking story because you can't see the thing. And so you're just making it up. And you're making up this silly, extraordinary explanation that somehow the electron doesn't know where it is. It's superimposed. I'm lost in a probability wave. Blah, blah, blah. And, no need for any of that crap. And again, it's proven with the multi-slit experiment. The multi-slit experiment is telling you there's no uncertainty because an image is projected at all the locations. There's nothing uncertain about an image. Images aren't made out of things in uncertain positions.
And see what they had to say on the subject. Thanks for watching, guys. Subscribe to my channel for more tutorials. Support me on
tutorials. Yeah, support me, pay me, do all this crap because I'm selling this bullshit. 100-year-old crap theory that we've spent billions of dollars merely to sit there and try to engineer it as a truth. So we only show you part of the evidence. We hide the single slit from you because that's just going to prove we're full of shit, because our explanation of why it splits in half is just ludicrous. Well, it splits in half because I drew a line in the middle and I said there's this half and there's this half. That's how it splits in half, is I decided to split it in half. There's no reasoning for why the wave splits in half, why there's two wave functions going through the single slit. No. I mean, your people are just so full of shit. So arrogant, so foolish. Yes, so please, everybody, give these liars more money. Give the conventional crapola bullshit theory more money. Just prove you're too frickin' stupid. You're stupid dupes. You've been fooled by a bunch of way up their own ass egotistical Looney Tunes who think they're superior when they haven't thought about any of this crap at all. All they can do is their little mathematical formulas because they've memorized the little speeches. And that's it. These people are profoundly underperforming as intelligences.
Patreon so I can keep making content. And as always, feel free to email me. Professor Dave Explains.
Right, I have to explain all this to you. I have to explain to you how to give me money. I have to explain to you how to subscribe. I have to explain to you because you people understand physics, because your people are worth teaching physics to. And a physics teacher has to explain this shit to his audience. I mean, if you think your audience is this fucking stupid, why don't you just say you are too fucking stupid to be walking around on this planet if I have to explain to you what a subscribe button is? It's a big red button sitting right there on the page. I have to explain it to you? Fuck.
At gmail.com.
And I have to play some music and I just hate this planet. Hate it, hate it, hate it. Just hate it. I hate it here. God damn. Idiots. So then he spams my fucking subscription with all this crap. He doesn't exactly look like that. But anyway. Ugh. Idiots everywhere. So, these shill things. How does anybody even watch this crap, right? So these physicists, all these up their ass intellectuals. Oh, I think I'm smart. Oh, we're so witty. We're so clever. They go out and they find, what did the dumbest human do today? Now, they're not even doing flat Earth videos, right? I mean, that's bad enough when you have to make complex theoretical videos to debunk flat earthers. I mean, like anybody should waste their time with that bullshit. But to sit there and now they're just goofing on stupid people. I mean, they're just, like I said, going out and saying, what did the stupidest person do today? Let's play his video and mock him. I mean, that's how courageous these warriors for the truth are. They're taking on absolute psychotic people. They're psychotic. I mean, some guy who thinks he doesn't need a driver's license because the Constitution says so, or something. I mean, it's just absolute nonsense. And they're wasting people's time mocking stupid people. I mean, this is such fail. And they call themselves the shills. I mean, it's just so bad. I mean, it's just on every level. You're saying, how could this... And then I'm saying you can't even watch it. It's such drool and drivel. It's so fucking absent of any kind of intelligence. Ugh. And you people will argue with me that these people are qualified. People who argue with flat earthers, they're the ones who are qualified. Yeah, right. No, they're the ones who are cowards, and they have a religious theory. Ugh. All right. So, till the next time.